Hey everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Risky Business Podcast. My name is Patrick Gray. We're going to talk through all of the week's security news with Adam Boileau in just a moment, and then it'll be time for this week's sponsor interview. And this week we're speaking with Justin Kohler from SpectreOps. SpectreOps, of course, makes Bloodhound and Bloodhound Enterprise, which is a tool that you can use to enumerate all of the attack paths in your organization. So you can, and then you can start closing them off, right? So you can discover what percentage of like user accounts in your org have dangerous configurations and permissions and things like that. And Justin's joining me to talk about how they've now married up their on-prem, like Active Directory Bloodhound version with their Azure one, or their Entra one, so that now you can track attack paths from AD into Entra and back. So they've had the Entra Azure product for a while. They've had the AD one, that's the OG product, and now they're working together, and a lot of their customers have been waiting for that, and it's working really well. So Justin will be joining us a little bit later on to talk through all of that. But first up, Adam, time to get into this week's news, and we're going to start uncharacteristically with some good news.
And not just that, good news from Microsoft, right? Which is doubly extra rare these days. Yes, they are announcing that multi-factor authentication will be mandatory for admin users of Azure. If you're going to log into the Azure product set, then you're going to have some manner of phishing-resistant MFA, they say.
Well, yeah. Well, more on that in just a moment, because their definition is a little bit funny there. That's bizarre. But I should say too, they actually announced this back in May, but they did it in the most confusing way possible, right? Like it even caused us trouble in our newsroom. You know, when we were preparing a bulletin on this for the Risky Business News, news broadcast in our other podcast channel, and the announcement goes, this July, Azure teams will begin rolling out additional tenant-level security measures to require multi-factor authentication. Establishing this security baseline at the tenant level puts in place additional security, blah, 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 blah. The reason it was confusing is because people were like, hang on, does this include service accounts? Does this include 365 users? Everyone was super confused. I mean, even if you scroll, I've included the link from May from Microsoft. Even if you scroll to the comments there, the top comment is, really? All users, no exception? Like service accounts? And Azure users, or all users with guests in Entra tenant, and which MFA authentication methods will be allowed or enforced? So they kind of botched the comms. And I remember, the reason I remember this so well is because you were editing the news bulletin. And I think at one point you'd added a line into the bulletin which was much more your interpretation of what they'd said instead of what they'd said, and we had this whole sort of discussion about it. And because the announcement was so poor, at least now we have clarity. It looks like what they're doing is, if you want to access Azure portal, right? So the actual Azure portal and like the guts of Azure, now you need MFA. So it's not 365 users. It doesn't apply to service accounts, but it's like, admin accounts, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, essentially anyone who has business logging into the Azure portal, which may not be admins, like in the literal sense of administrative accounts, but they're people who are doing, Azure business as opposed to end users in your IT environment that happens to be on Azure. But yeah, super unclear. A little more clear now, which is good. Yeah. And obviously the overall plan of introducing more multi-factor auth, absolutely a step in the right direction. And they are working on, so right now it's for like interactive, like end user logins or admin end users. So people logging into the portal. If you're using command line tools and PowerShell integrations and those kinds of things, they are also going to introduce MFA requirements for those in a couple of months by the look of it, or maybe early next year. So all of this is absolutely, steps in the right direction, and, makes total sense. It's just, it really underscores the, quite how confusing Microsoft's nomenclature is, that we don't really understand what they're talking about when they say Azure users.
Well, yeah, I mean, people were freaking out in the education sector because they thought that all of their students would require MFA, and so like it was in the end, even back in the bulletin, if you go look for it or go back to Catalan's newsletter write up of it, we even wrote like, if they mean admin accounts, this is pretty spectacularly botched comms, and it's quite funny. And yeah, it turns out that was actually right. So phase 1 starts in October. MFA will be required to sign into Azure Portal, Microsoft Entra Admin Center, and Intune Admin Center, which is why I said admins, right? So it is essentially for human admins. So this is what they announced for July. Now they've announced that it's happening in October. Fine, whatever. Phase 2 is beginning in early 2025, gradual enforcement of MFA at sign-in for Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, Azure mobile app, and infrastructure as code. So, I mean, this is really cool. What's funny is they're saying that the pillars of their secure futures initiative is like ensuring 100% of user accounts are protected with securely managed phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. And that's what we're doing. And then later in this same blog post where they say everyone needs to have MFA and that their goal is phishing resistant, they're like, yeah, you can use, FIDO keys, you can use pass keys through the Microsoft Authenticator app, which is really cool that they support that now, and I think that's fantastic. But then they also say, oh yeah, and if you want, you can use SMS-based MFA, which is like not phishing resistant, guys.
Not
but
really phishing resistant.
Yeah.
No.
But they have to, right? Like there is no way that everybody's going to be able to go and use pass keys. I mean, although at this point I sort of feel like with pass key support for the Microsoft Authenticator app, like I don't quite understand why they're still supporting SMS, but the Microsoft world is so big. I'm guessing they've done the math and they figured out that they just have to.
Yeah, and I mean, there's all sorts of other markets that aren't, Europe or the West, or the US, where, things can be a bit more complicated locally, either in terms of cost or access to devices or whatever else, or even just, updates can be challenging somewhere just because of like the sheer size of Windows updates. Maybe it's difficult to get Edge or whatever that has modern support. I don't know, whatever excuses, but they've clearly done the research and decided that it's a thing that they are stuck with for a little while. Because if they could say no SMS or no voice, like phone call approvals, they probably would, but clearly they can't. Yeah,
I mean, exactly, right? And yeah, I mean, any way you dress it up, it is good news. You love to see it, and it will probably move the needle. Funnily enough, though, if SMS authentication had a slogan, if you were trying to market it, you'd say, it's better than nothing, but only just, right? It's pretty much how it is, because it is phishable, but, it's good that they're moving the needle on this. Now let's talk about this national public data hack. Krebs on security, Brian Krebs, I think he has the best coverage on this. I think Lily Hay Newman had a better headline, though, right? Because she described this hack as a slow burn, and it absolutely has been, because we've come across news snippets relating to this hack in dribs and drabs since April, and it's never really hit the threshold for us to quite bother talking about it yet, because back in April it was like, yeah, some data broker, some shady data broker on the dark web was shopping around this database that apparently contained, billions of social security numbers, and they published some snippets, and we were sort of stuck at the, well, is this real phase or are they pretending? And, just little dribs and drabs of information have come out. Then, I think a couple of weeks ago, someone lodged a class action lawsuit alleging that the company did in fact lose all of this information. And now the thing that's busted it wide open is a short time ago, this entire data set was published to the dark web, and it checks out, it's legit. So Brian's gone and written the whole thing up. He's got 2 stories up, both are great, which really look at like who this company is, and that's bizarre enough. Like who the company is, how they got the data, how they got owned, and what and how it sort of wound up sort of trickling out. There's some nuance here, like some of the data, a couple million people in the data, like they're actually deceased, right? So that's good. But the scope of this thing is like pretty extraordinary, right? So why don't you just walk us through this one? Because it's amazing.
So the story goes that this guy, Salvatore Verini, who seems to have like been an actor who has played cops in movies and stuff, and is also an actual ex-cop of some sort, runs a company or a set of companies that market this data, the data and background checky types of services. And those websites, set of websites and companies do seem pretty fly-by-night shonky. Like, for example, they had, until I think, 2 days ago, if you just asked for /members.zip on one of their sites, it would return a zip with a whole bunch of data, including clear text passwords and details for the site itself as well as users. And then things like the users of the sites all have the same default password, etc., etc. Anyway, the data set has something like 2.9 billion rows as reported, something like 270 million unique social security numbers. And as you say, there's a range of ages of the data. And you kind of get the feeling that this data has been kind of cobbled together, sort of once, and then packaged up and resold by this company, in ways that, the US background checking ecosystem is just kind of, anyone can do it. It's weird and fly by night and kind of gross. But yeah, you don't really get to see where the data comes from, how it gets arranged, how it gets maintained, all those sorts of things when you're buying and selling it. So the data set feels a little bit funny, and people, now that it's been exposed, are digging into it and finding out. Like, for example, there's a bunch of people who are more than 120 years old, because, the data set is not particularly well maintained. And if anything, it's just a kind of a good summary of how weird the US data broker ecosystem is.
Well, anyone can just hang out a shingle and do it, right? Which is the amazing thing. And this, this guy who is the former actor / producer / bounty hunter or whatever the hell he was, like the fact that he can just go and collect all of this stuff, apparently from public sources too, is just mind-boggling, right? That there's no weird sort of regulation that means that if you're going to be doing this sort of thing, you need to do it properly. I suppose the natural defense in the US legal system is that he's probably about to be sued into oblivion, right? So that's, that's...
Hopefully.
Well, I think those sort of lawsuits in the United States sort of take the place of certain types of regulation that we have in other countries, right? Like, it's just a natural part of how their system works. But you read about this guy, Florida man, I call him, because he's a Floridian. And it's just, the whole thing is just bizarre. Like, how did this guy manage to pull all this together and then just do such a bad job of hosting it? It's mind-boggling. But yeah, as you point out, like, it could be, social security numbers and various personal details on the majority of the US population, which is just staggering.
Yeah, it is pretty wild, and I imagine he is going to get sued into oblivion. But yeah, it's just, how many operations are there like this, right?
Yeah.
And this one's particularly egregious, I suppose. But I think Krebs talked to some of the people who've been involved in the underground scene where the data was being posted. And even the guy that posted it back in April said that he wasn't the person that actually originally got it. It had been kicking around for a while. Like, this is pretty normal every day on the dark web, the scary underground dark webs. And, short of an overhaul of US privacy legislation and data handling, like, this is just how it's going to be.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, that part where they were talking about how it was kicking around did remind me of the Hell Pizza thing, which is a story I've told on the show a couple of times, but like a long, long time ago, back in the day, there was a really popular pizza chain in the in New Zealand called Hell Pizza. And, pretty much everyone in New Zealand has ordered from Hell Pizza at one time or another, right? Yeah. So the way that you would do that is you would do online ordering, and it was through some horrible Flash front end, and there was no like input sanitization. So if you just put a database query in it, essentially it'd just, crap out the entire database.
The Flash app talked to like SQL gateway.jsp and then had an argument query, and you just put SQL queries in it, is what I heard.
Yeah, so is what you heard. Yeah, right, buddy. And that's the thing, right, is that database, because everybody created, accounts for that database wound up being passed around among a lot of pen testers and red teamers in New Zealand, right? Because if they needed the password for some corporate account, they would just look up their Hell Pizza account and then they would be able to use that. But unfortunately, criminals were also doing this as well. And of course, the security consultants had tried reporting this to the company and they just got blown off. So eventually a few people asked me, they're like, Patrick, can you please, go in there and say, I'm a journalist writing a story about it. Like, they've got to close this up because it's a real liability. And of course I went to them and wrote it up as a story, which turned into like an absolute media circus in New Zealand. And I think the owners of the company at one point were accusing me of colluding with a former business partner of theirs because they were going through some sort of acquisition, and it turned into a whole thing. But yes, that's the Hell Pizza story. And, sometimes these just gigantic data sets, I mean, in this case, it came from public records. In other cases, it can come from a pizza store, right? Like, it's just, this stuff just winds up everywhere, which leads me. Oh, go on. You've got something there?
I was going to say, if I may, there was one beautiful gem that I really loved about that Hell Pizza story, which is when someone asked the guy if the data had been stolen, he said, no, it's still there. Yeah,
I love it. I love it. Funnily enough, though, once they'd figured out that I actually was a journalist and not some operative, like working for their the partner they were having a problem with, I wound up having a very friendly chat at the end of it all with one of the owners, and they said, funnily enough, it actually turned out to be really good for their business because Hell Pizza was being talked about on the news 24/7, and it got everyone thinking, gee, I could go for one of those pizzas right now. So apparently it was like their best sales week ever. Which is, I guess, explains a lot of things about our industry.
So good.
Now, this actually dovetails nicely with a story out of Australia. And I don't want to spend too long on this because our colleague, Tom Uran, is currently investigating this as we speak. And I'll talk to him about this tomorrow on our Seriously Risky Business podcast in our other podcast feed. But the Australian government is actually spinning up a identity service called Trust Exchange. And the reason I think this is worth mentioning in today's show is because it's really designed, the thinking behind this seems quite solid, which is it's designed for people to be able to attest to their identity to whoever without actually having to hand over their information. So it is a proper identity service. The devil is going to be in the details. I'm sure the implementation will be horrid. The last time they tried to do something similar was the Centrelink card. And the crypto, it was a smart card that was going to go to anyone who interacted with the welfare agency Centrelink, which a lot of middle-class people in Australia do as well, because there's various childcare rebates and whatever. So, 95% of Australians were going to get one of these cards. But the crypto was a mess. I remember researchers looking at it and it was horrible. But this, they're having another crack at this idea. And I just think in this day and age, either governments or banks or, these large institutions need to develop services that are going to allow people to attest to their identity without handing over all of their information so that we can avoid some of these catastrophes, right? Like, we need robust identity. Eventually, if you build a system like this and it's working, eventually you can, plumb these through to IDPs and whatever and actually get good online identity attestation. So I think it's good to see the government making steps here. I'm sure there's going to be mistakes, but we have to get there eventually, right?
Yeah, I agree, right? Being able to, the best data that, from the point of view of having it stolen, the best data is data you don't have, right? If you don't need to keep it, you don't need to, store that data, then it can't be stolen from you. And that's a great place to be as a business. But sometimes you have requirements for, validating age, for example, where, now what are you going to do? Store everybody's, driver's licenses or whatever other documents they provide. Like, if there's a way to do this that doesn't involve having to store it, but that is trustable and attestable, and that the companies and organizations relying on it can say, hey, we are doing this, we're meeting our obligations, and we're doing so in a way that doesn't store that data, then great. And government and some other, things like, as I said, banks or whatever else are in a great place to be able to do that. But the devil is in the details, and governments are not known for, smooth, well thought out IT projects.
Yeah.
So, I think, several governments around the world have tried things like the, Estonian national smart card, identity system, is an example that has been held up in the past, but there is a lot of details. And I think, it's the natural path forward. It's just finding the right way, a good implementation that balances all of the equities involved and different groups and so on.
Well, I think the federal government here is sort of well situated to do something like this. I think if something similar were proposed in the United States, it might lead to a revolution, because the idea of the federal government being responsible for your identity wouldn't work. But perhaps, banks or, similar sort of institutions that touch a lot of people, everyone sort of has a bank account, right? Or most people have bank accounts. Yeah. So being able to enroll...
Telcos kind of fell into that role, as mobile phones became a way of authenticating your identity. So, there are some examples of this happening in the private sector that are not perfect.
Well, they did a great job, didn't they? Telcos. Wow, Adam, good example.
But it's better than nothing.
Yeah.
Much like SMS authentication. So
yeah. I mean, I don't think it'll happen in the telco space, to be honest, but I would think more, banks, post office. I don't know. Post office is a national institution. Anyway, let's see where it goes. But the point is, if you want to run a society that's not, where it's not a disaster, if this sort of data leaks, this is the sort of project you're looking at, right?
Yeah, agreed.
Now, moving on to some more technical news, and Germany's sort of peak cyber agency wants changes to what Microsoft allows security vendors to do in the kernel. Of course, this comes after the CrowdStrike disaster. I think we're going to start seeing people float ideas for what Microsoft needs to do here, and that's going to be a very complicated discussion. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, anytime that regulators or governments or, kind of outside groups start meddling with technical design issues, like what belongs in the kernel, how should that access work, how should it be verified, how does driver signing work, how do Windows hardware quality labs processes, but all of those things are a mix of policy goals and technical implementation details, and there is a lot of trade-off and thinking there, and in some cases, like, we never really thought that this would become a political issue. How long ago did we settle on, monolithic kernel plus userland as the kind of architecture versus microkernels or whatever other kind of academic options? So anytime people get involved in those things from the outside, it can be a mess. That said, right, the CrowdStrike debacle, you can see why. A place like the European Union would think, well, maybe this is a thing we should stick our oar into. But it's particularly funny in the EU because there is existing EU regulation that requires Microsoft to open access to the kernel.
Well,
for
slow your
security
roll.
vendors and whatever else.
Slow your roll there, because that's not... there was an EU sort of agreement between the EU and Microsoft, which people have said quite often means that they can't kick people out of the kernel. But I don't believe that the kernel access is actually mentioned in the agreement. It's much more about having the same level of access for Defender as for other things. So it's much more around competition. It's kind of agnostic when it comes to the kernel. But yeah, this obviously touches issues around competition. You can't get into a situation where Microsoft's own security tooling has preferential access to Windows because that puts us in a bad place. I also don't think that they should move to a API-based model like macOS or macOS has, because you sort of stifle innovation at that point. Like being able to actually do things in the kernel and experiment in the kernel drives a lot of innovation. People think of new ideas, and that's the place they're going to get applied. And if you lock that out completely, you are locking out the innovation. Now, should people be running the bulk of their product in kernel mode? I think that's there's some questions that could be asked around there. Now, as much as it's, European cyber agencies looking into this, we might look at that and go, well, are they really the best people to do this? There are some very smart people thinking about this at the moment. One of them, I won't say who it is because I didn't ask them if I could, but I've spoken to them. They're one of the world's foremost experts on Windows kernel security and Windows internals, and they're working with a couple of others on coming up with some ideas about how you would actually have a sensible regime that would sort of scope what sort of access is appropriate here and what changes Microsoft might be able to make that would enable a lot of these security players to actually get out of the kernel. Because if there are places where they can move out, generally speaking, they do it. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here, and I'm actually surprised by Microsoft's reaction, which has actually been quite nuanced and sensible. And actually, and statements like these from various regulators and agencies where they're like, this is something that we need to improve, instead of, blah, we need to kick everyone out of the kernel, or, you know, blah, we need to do this, or blah, we need to do that. Everybody's saying we need to think about this. And I think really, like, what better reaction could you expect? Like, what could you hope for? You know, this is great.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. No, I agree. Like, we need to think about it, and think about it we shall. And I think, you know, you make a good point that given an option to implement their products not in kernel space, most vendors would prefer to not have this responsibility. Like, they would prefer to be in a place where their screwing up doesn't ground all the planes in the world. You know, that's not what you want. So if you give them viable options, they will use them for their own reason, you know, for their own benefit. It's not just, you know, because it improves the ecosystem as a whole. So, you know, it's a natural place for industry and big vendors like Microsoft to work together, coordinate, figure out how they could do it, and onwards from there. You know, what value regulators have in that conversation, I guess, is, you know, kind of up for debate.
Well, I mean, I think the fact that they are just indicating that they're paying attention is positive, actually, because it is a little bit of a motivator for Microsoft to want to solve this problem. So, you know, in this case, I think it's nice to see some govies piping up, actually.
Big regulation, Pat. Yeah, that's who you are.
Well, I'm not saying they're I don't know if I'd support them regulating, but, you know, at least piping up, that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, agreed. Very agreed.
All right. Speaking of govies piping up, we've got a statement here from the ODNI, FBI, and CISA confirming that Iran was responsible for the hack and presumably the leak out of Donald Trump's campaign. Of course, these actors also targeted the Harris campaign, so the Harris-Waltz campaign. So, you know, we've got some confirmation there. I don't think it was really ever in doubt. You know, Chris Krebs, who was, of course, the first director of CISA, he was all over Twitter immediately saying, I have it on good authority that this was Iran and that the Trump campaign is telling the truth. There were a lot of people out there who really disliked Trump who were saying, yeah, they're making it up as if this was Iran, that sort of thing. But no, it was odds were always on that it was them. And now we've got at least the deep state has weighed in here, Adam, to throw its support behind this attribution.
Yeah, no, it's good to see some confirmation, so we can all kind of integrate this knowledge into our understanding and move on with life. But you're right, the US election cycle is just such a show. You know? Yeah, sure is. Sitting here watching and popcorn.
And if anyone's interested in a discussion that I had with Chris Krebs and Alex Stamos all about that hack and leak and election interference generally this cycle and how it's different to 2016, we discussed that in the most recent episode of Wide World of Cyber, which you can find on our YouTube channel or in our podcast feed. Moving on, and we've got a great story here from John Grieg over at The Record, and some cryptocurrency company. An attacker managed to get access to like their workspace admin page and just change all their passwords, lock them out. And then they don't really appear to have much insight into what the attackers did after that, which is like, I would be feeling quite uncomfortable about that if I were them.
Yeah, it's been quite a mess. This company is in the crypto space, so you would imagine they would lose a bunch of money in the process, but they don't seem to be saying that this resulted in large-scale theft of crypto, which presumably was the reason for going in the first place. They've sold something like $500 million worth of unique coins, but you know, they're not saying that it's all gone, and we haven't seen anyone, you know, from the blockchain intelligence companies saying, you know, that they've seen it. But mostly, I put this one in the run sheet this week because I just wanted everyone to imagine what that's like, having your entire G Suite life of your company, you know, just showing up one morning and computer says no. Yeah, and admin can't log in, users can't log in, entirely dead in the water, and then you've got to try and convince Google to do something about it, which again, like that'll be a fun phone call, I guess. So, well,
I mean, they were locked out for 4 days, and I was thinking, how? Like, you know, that's something went wrong there, right?
Yeah, we don't really know. And then the extra cherry on top of the story is when they started to restore this stuff, they went looking to try and figure out what was going on. As you say, they don't really have any clear idea of what happened whilst the attackers were in, but they did find that one of their employees, like a contractor, had forged identity, and there was some other, kind of weird issues with some of their stuff. So they found other stuff when they looked, but that must have been a crazy day at the office.
I think the US authorities are going to be able to get on top of this North Korea contractor problem, actually. And I think they've found the vulnerable link in the chain, which are these basements full of laptops using RDP or whatever, right? Yeah. So, I mean, really, all it takes is for a company to say, we've just discovered that this contractor is probably a North Korean. And then they just need to trace back their access to the basement farm, get the basement laptop farm, get a warrant. Then they roll in there and find out that there's 50 laptops all being RDP controlled by North Koreans and shut them down, right? And I think that's going to be a pretty efficient sort of enforcement action. And I just wonder, it's really going to be up to people to report this type of activity. But I was just thinking about that and I'm like, as long as people are reporting, like for every report you get, you're going to find one of these farms and take out like 50 fake contractors, right? So it's sort of like an enforcement action that scales. Know what I mean?
Yeah. Like it's definitely, there is actionable stuff. Like when you get reports of these, pretty much one-to-one, because there's going to be a laptop somewhere. There's going to be like someone's looking after it, farming it, etc. Whereas, compared to regular crypto theft, like it's not clear when you report to the feds, that your crypto's been nicked, what they're going to do about it. Whereas there is just a clear path to some enforcement action, some response.
I got to say, the crypto people that I know who work for crypto exchanges, like I know people who are not into cryptocurrency at all, but they work at crypto exchanges just because like they want an extreme job, right? They want to do real CISO. I mean, they're in there hand to hand with like some of the world's best attackers using TTPs that like aren't documented, and they've got the authority to build all sorts of controls and detections, and they love their jobs, right? Like even though they think the companies they work for are kind of dumb, they get to go up against real attackers and get to build real defenses, and they just they love full combat cyber, right? Like where else do you get that?
Yeah, exactly. If that's what you're into, it's definitely the place to do it.
And speaking of, we first saw this. There was an attack. It was a tweet from Zach XBT, who's a blockchain researcher who watches the blockchain for unusual stuff happening. And it looked like, potential victim, looks like sort of since mostly confirmed, someone got 4,064 Bitcoin stolen from him, which is market value of about $238 million US. And I excitedly popped this into Slack going, holy crap, look at this. And I think Catalin Kimpanu, our colleague, is like, that's like the third biggest this year, which is it's just amazing, right?
Yeah.
So someone pitched this cash, I think from Genesis Market or something. And then they've scattered this, they've tried to launder this stuff. Unfortunately for them though, like this stuff is always going to be tainted and linked to a theft. So what happens to these Bitcoins from here? I don't even know.
Yeah, I saw the, I think Slow Mist made a graph showing how the Bitcoins are kind of moved through the various blockchains as they were laundered. And like, it just must, like you read about numbers like that, you think like, stealing $200 million in a single heist, like that would be the heist of a career if you're a physical bank robber, but then you got to fence it and get on with your life. It must be really galling to be sitting on $200 million worth of Bitcoin and actually getting it out and using it for whatever you want to do. And, it's just pretty difficult, and you're always going to be looking over your shoulder. Doesn't sound like fun to me.
No, and I should clarify too. I said Genesis Market by accident, which was a dark web crime forum. This is, of course, the completely legitimate Genesis Global Trading. So my bad.
It's got global in it. It's definitely legitimate. Yes.
Yeah. But it is funny, and you wonder, like, what's the clock? Like, is this like the bank robber who's in prison who buried their stash? You know what I mean? And one day they're going to go dig it up, or like, how does that all work? I don't know. It would be frustrating.
I don't know.
Now let's talk about China tech supply chains here, and a couple of pieces we got which sort of speak to the distrust around Chinese manufactured technology. And in both of these cases, it sort of comes down to, are these deliberate backdoors, or is this just crappy engineering, basically, right? So the first one we're going to talk about is TP-Link. So a couple of Congress people in the United States are asking the Commerce Department to investigate TP-Link, investigate the risks posed by TP-Link. This is James Reddick wrote this one up for the record. And okay, sure, they're like, there's a lot of bugs in TP-Link stuff, and Vault Typhoon are known to use networks of routers and whatever home routers to stage various attacks. So I don't know what they're thinking here. I mean, maybe they're thinking that the government is asking TP-Link not to patch stuff so that they get easier access, or maybe they're thinking, well, these things are just really vulnerable, and we need to look at regulating the use of them. But I mean, mostly what I'm catching here is just like a couple of Congress people saying, well, this is Chinese, so it's sinister. Was that your vibe here as well?
Yeah, I mean, TP-Links are, their devices in general are, pretty standard issue. Get the job done, not always super quality, not super well supported over time, but, it's just kind of like normal consumer electronics stuff. And, we've seen some bugs in there in web interfaces, and, I think there was a universal plug and play bug that they had a while ago. But it's just, it feels like normal TP linking, like normal vendory stuff. When, so Catalan wrote this up in this week's Risky Biz News, and I was editing it. And I had I had some mental thing that TP-Link was Singaporean, not Chinese. And so I went and Googled, headquarters in Singapore and blah, 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 blah. And then we went looking, and as you pointed out, they've been Singaporean for 2 years. They're now currently headquartered in California and Singapore. And the Chinese TP-Link is a totally separate company and not at all related, they said.
Nothing to see here. I mean, it is interesting that they announced, a few years ago, they announced this intention to restructure their operations. And it just reminded me of Group IB, which was a Russian, threat intel company.
Yes.
I think one of their, founders or whatever is in prison in Russia or whatever. But one of the, they moved their company to Singapore. I believe they did actually, quite a few of their people did actually go to Singapore. But it's sort of like saying, yeah, we're a Singaporean company. We have nothing to do with Russia. And they were really pushing that a few years ago when they did it. And this is the same sort of thing. It's like, Chinese, what are you talking about? We're based in Singapore and California. It's like, well, kind of.
Yeah. So, I mean, we don't know if it's going to go full Huawei on them, or whether it's just a case of, TP-Link will, maybe improve the amount of patches they release. I don't know. But this didn't feel like there was, to your intro to this, it didn't feel like there was any kind of accusation of backdoors or whatever else. It was just product engineering, not super great. But the other one that is in this pair is a story about Shanghai Fudan Microelectronics, who are a pretty big manufacturer of smart cards and access control systems and so on. And they have a line of smart cards which are based on the NXP MyFair Classic, which is, an older standard. And a researcher was fuzzing these cards and found some undocumented instructions that they were responding to. And then with a bit of extra work, turns out that there is a hard-coded backdoor key that you can use to, read out the contents of these cards and effectively clone them. And this backdoor has been there for, a couple of, maybe a decade, 15 years, something like that. And these are widely used in hotel door locks and things like that. And, these feel a little bit more it's hard to tell the difference between engineering backdoor and backdoor.
What's a debugger?
It doesn't feel good.
What's a debugger and what's a backdoor? It feels like that, right? What is a bit of code that the engineers included because it helped them do engineering stuff and they accidentally shipped it versus, a PRC directed backdoor in cards used in the West. But I mean, I think something that mitigates this as big news is that we haven't really had security expectations around MyFair cards for quite a while, right? Yes.
Yeah, well, not the MyFair Classics. No, those have been broken in other ways for a long time. But I mean, this is trivial, insta-clone these cards, which, you know, if you were a hotel chain, would certainly be of concern to you, because there's a difference between, you know, I can clone one card, but it takes a bunch of effort and you have to kind of be targeted versus, you know, trivially just walk up to a lock and open it kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say if backdoor or, you know, just bad.
But that's kind of what I'm getting at, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just impossible to tell. And I think maybe the moral of the story here is don't use crap tech, you know, like don't use TP-Link for anything important. Don't use these. But then again, I mean, TP-Link stuff isn't really used for anything important. You know, it's mostly home-based stuff, but there's this sort of additive thing, isn't there? When there's millions of them out there on your public networks, like that can be a problem if someone is controlling them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, it can be hard to tell when something is cheap and crap, you know, like, you know, Cisco bought Linksys. You know, Linksys was a big kind of home device manufacturer once upon a time. And now there's a bunch of, like, when you get a Cisco low-end Cisco Edge device, like, is it really a Cisco? Is it just a Linksys in a coat? We don't really know. So, you know, it can be hard to tell where it's a, you know, where it's a legitimate brand or, you know, a legitimate one. And maybe the Cisco Linksys one is a bad example because it's kind of historical now. But, you know, I mean, it's, yeah, if you're buying smart cards from major, you know, this is, you know, they're a big vendor. Like, this would be a reputable in quotes in terms of market share vendor.
They're not a nobody company is what you're saying, right?
They're not a nobody.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Now, look, I want to move on to this story. Well, it's Checkpoint. It's research out of Checkpoint that is delightful. It is my favorite story of the week. I found it absolutely hilarious because so there's this malware called Stick Stealer. They like rent it out. The operators of the malware or the developers rent it out to people. It steals browser data, IM sessions for Telegram and Discord, steals cryptocurrency, that sort of stuff, right? So it's like crimeware. And I think it reports back like the exfilled material into Telegram. And these researchers from Checkpoint managed to get into one of these Telegram channels, right? Which is essentially a C2. And then they noticed a bit of a data dump into that channel that was not like the others, Adam. And that seems a good place to begin.
So the developer of this particular tool, which is essentially, there's an open source tool called the Femidrone Stealer, and this is basically just kind of like a rebadged, commercially supported version of this open source tool. So the developer of that had infected his test system, like his development system, whilst working on it. And I'm not sure if that's just because he was testing it or whatever. Anyway, and it stole all his data and uploaded it to the channel. Which a little bit orcs. And then I think the way this started was that the Checkpoint researchers were tracking a guy who turned out to be a Nigerian, you know, cyber criminal who was using this software. And then they went from the key material used to crypto the data being uploaded to Telegram in this, and then pivoted on that and back and found this particular unencrypted, you know, zip that had been uploaded that then outed the developer. And then they looked at the data that was being stolen from the developer system and found his communications with the Nigerian guy that was using it, and then managed to piece together the identities of all the people involved. The developer turned out to be Turkish. The Nigerian spammer turned out to be a pretty well-known guy. But it's just, you know, when it's such a beautiful thing when these people fall victim to their own tools and then gets used against them by researchers or whatever else. And, you know, Checkpoint have written it up in excruciatingly delicious detail, and it's well worth a read if you're into this particular type of, you know, Schadenfreude.
Yes, this particular developer managed to shoot themselves in the crotch, I think is the best way to describe this.
Dear.
And what I like it too is they're like, well, here's the Spanish phone number that they used to register the Telegram account, but here's his real number. Which is in Turkey. And like, you know, this person is gonna have problems, right? Like they're probably booking flights right now. Because drama is coming. Now we're gonna end with a couple of sort of funnier stories. Well, I suppose this first one isn't that funny, but a guy in New Jersey has been charged with hacking and extorting his employer last year. This guy, Daniel Ryan, abused his position as core infrastructure engineer to create a secret virtual machine on his company network, and he used the VM to run automated scripts that changed the passwords of employee accounts, deleted backups, and shut down his employer's servers, and then used an email account to demand a $750,000 ransom to be paid, I guess, to make him stop. So Catalan found the court documents there and just did a little write-up in one of our newsletter editions. But this isn't the first time we've seen this by far. I mean, I think the new thing is, back in the day when you used to see a disgruntled ex-employee do bad stuff, it wasn't necessarily financially motivated. But these days you're seeing people, what was the one? Brian Krebs got dragged into it. It was some vendor, and the employee was going out there and making claims about the attack, and there was a ransom element to it as well. I mean, this is just something that happens now, right? Where just one of your employees one day just decides to cause havoc and try to shake you down.
Yeah, and I guess in the old days, they would cause the business disruption, but there wasn't really a way for them to make profit out of it. And now, you can disrupt the business and there's a chance you'll get a big payday, which, if you're disgruntled with your employer, maybe you feel you're entitled to, or something like that. But they inevitably screw it up because, the point of a ransomware crew is that you have to build some reputation that you will follow through, delete the data, or provide the keys or whatever it is. And so you have to have some backstory and identity. And these people, of course, are fresh, clean skin ransomware operators, effectively. And they screw up and end up getting caught because they don't have enough experience of being a ransomware affiliate. Like, it would make more sense to go out and join a ransomware program, or find someone who is, offer up the access, offer to run the tools or whatever to deploy it, have them do the ransomware for it, and then take a cut. Like, that would be a much smarter way to do this. But, these are generally people making emotional choices, not rational.
Yeah, well, I mean, this guy hardly seems like a master cyber criminal, right? Because first of all, it wasn't actually ransomware. It was just they were causing chaos from this VM that they spun up in the environment. So of course the FBI turned up, looked at the VM and traced it back to his laptop. It wasn't. Anyway.
Mastermind.
And he spun up a new email account to email the threat, and I'm guessing there might have been some evidence there as well. So yeah, certainly not, sort of like I'd call it Dread Pirate Roberts syndrome, right? Where you think your OPSEC is up here, but actually it's down here. Look,
F tier.
In the same vein, this guy, a Kentucky man, has just been sentenced to 81 months in prison. So nearly 7 years. And among the things that put him there was he used a stolen credential to access a government system in Hawaii, the Hawaii Death Registry system, to basically fake his own death so he could get out of paying like $100,000 in child support, which is just like, first of all, a really scummy crime, and second of all, just really dumb. Like, are you going to declare yourself legally dead for $100,000? It's kind of hard to live your life when you are legally dead. It's not easy to get a loan. It's not easy to get a driver's license when you are dead. I mean, maybe this person was a master of using stolen identities or whatever, but if that were the case, why would they need to declare the death? I don't know. The whole thing is just so bizarre. He's in prison. Sounds like his children will be much better off with him there. And what a weird one. Again, from James Reddick at The Record, this one.
Yeah, not a well thought through set of crimes. And I mean, yeah, probably everybody has got what they deserve in the situation. And yeah, I mean, I feel bad for the kids, but also, as you say, maybe better off.
I mean, someone doing this to get out of $100,000 in parking tickets, you're sort of sitting there thinking, ha, nice try, buddy, but to get out of child support, you're just like, no, man, you go to prison.
Yeah.
You go to prison.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, mate. Well, that is it for this week's news segment. Thanks so much for joining me to chat about it all as usual. And we'll do it all again next week.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pat. I will see you then.
All right, so it is time for this week's sponsor interview now with Justin Kohler of SpectreOps. SpectreOps, of course, makes Bloodhound Enterprise, which you can use to enumerate all of the attack paths through your directory. they've been doing this for Active Directory for a very long time. They've been doing it for Azure, Entra, for a shorter time. But what they've just announced is that they can now track attack paths or enumerate attack paths from Entra down into AD or vice versa, right? So you can actually start following a lot of these attack paths through hybrid environments. Now, there are so many hybrid environments out there. Unless you're a very new business, you're unlikely to be completely cloud only. And unless you're a really backwards business, it's unlikely that you don't at least use something like Office 365 or M365. So, this has been a requirement for their customers for a long time, and they finally shipped it. So Justin joined me to talk about that, and here he is.
Good. So yeah, since the beginning, when we launched Bloodhound, it started with Active Directory. So we modeled paths within Active Directory, and then some years ago, I think in 2022, we added coverage for Azure. But since then, they've always been two distinct databases. So on our end, that you couldn't cross, you couldn't look at an attack path from one to the other, even though that we know there are ways to cross from Active Directory to Azure. There's a bunch of reasons why we didn't do that. A lot of it is complexity, and like handling that size of graph on our end was a challenge. But I'm happy to let everybody know that we released support for that in Bloodhound Enterprise and Community Edition just a couple weeks ago. So now you can traverse attack paths from Active Directory to Azure and back down again. This is our first iteration of a hybrid attack path. So we know of multiple between Active Directory and Azure, and we are tracking multiple between, let's say, Azure and other platforms. But this is our first and kind of main request from the bulk of our user base and our customers.
Well, I mean, that makes sense, because for any enterprise that didn't start yesterday, they're running a hybrid directory, right?
Yes.
Almost all of them, they're traditionally an AD environment, and they've gone up to O365 or whatever, which magically makes them sort of Entra ID or Azure users, right? I'm guessing that's the rationale here, that you needed to do this.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think everybody recognized that Azure had a bunch of security enhancements above Active Directory, but we also knew that it was connected to Active Directory. So you kind of, while you have some enhancements, you also have all of the legacy problems of Active Directory if you're connected. So we were connecting them through user syncing, so with password write back. And there's a whole bunch of best practice delivered by Microsoft in terms of like you shouldn't sync privileged roles. But since enabling this a couple of weeks ago, we've already found a bunch of paths crossing that plane. Beginning with the most horrific example where you're syncing a user that's a global administrator. Down to just like Microsoft gives guidance in terms of best practice for not syncing any privileged role. But a lot of administrators would be like, well, why? Okay, I get it for global admin, but why this role? And it's because they open up paths back down to their legacy environment. And we can see that any path into Azure, in most customer environments, eventually will terminate into a global admin. So we've seen a couple of those. The interesting things is we're seeing like ADCS attack paths that take over at the Active Directory environment, and then that gives you power over synced users, and then that synced user will give you power over the Azure tenant. I think the most interesting one to us so far is we found an attack path across 3 different domain trusts up to Azure, down to a different domain, so 4th domain, and then up to Azure again for global administrator. So they can be really short, they can be really long and complicated, but the end result is, I think the fear that a lot of people had about a hybrid environment, we can actually start to articulate why they have that fear.
You can draw them a picture now,
exactly.
which is great. But I mean, I think also when you talk to people about tools around directory tools, a lot of people fell into the trap of thinking, well, Microsoft fixed that with, Entra, right? Like AD is horrible, so Microsoft's fixed that. And, they have, as you say, they've taken away some of the foot guns. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is that directories, like it doesn't matter what tech stack you're running a directory on, directories are just inherently complicated. Like once they get over a certain size, the fact that you've got permissions and privileges that allow you to do things in an environment, whether that's extract information or do some damage or provision users or whatever it is, it's just inherently going to touch security. There's inherently going to be misconfigurations. There's inherently going to be attack paths. And it doesn't matter whether it's on-prem or whether it's cloud or how much of a good job your directory provider has done in trying to take away those foot guns. Like, fundamentally, there's always going to be security issues with any directory.
Yeah, I think any one of us could hold maybe 10 people's permissions in their head and probably work out where those might cross. But there's more than 10 people in most organizations today. And like trying to figure that out is just enormously complex. And what I think what most people's frustration today is in Azure, and I'm not blaming Microsoft here. Things change for good reason, right? But like things change and have cascading effects that you didn't really understand. Maybe either like when you put the permission in place, or because of that change, how is that permission rolled out? So yes, it will cross security, and I think where we differentiate a little bit here is we're going kind of beyond a stereotypical just like access graph, like this user has access to do this thing, and putting like more of the adversarial, like this access can turn into subsequent access. So like we call that the adversary view of the environment. So,
well, I'm guessing. Sorry to cut you off there, but I'm guessing this is already proving very popular. Like, I know it's been a very short time, but I'm guessing this is already like a smash hit, right? With the sort of customers that you sell to.
Absolutely. Like our customers have been waiting for this for a long time, and they're all really excited when we started showing them like the research that we were doing, and because like we researched this in customer environments to see how widespread this issue would be, and it was in most. When we lit the feature up, then everybody was really excited to go test it out and find those boundaries that have been crossed.
So just to inject some levity here, one of my favorite stories, and sorry to cut you off, but one of my favorite stories about Enter ID, like a misconfiguration, not a subtle attack path sort of thing, but I know someone who was privy to a incident response gig where they discovered through the IR gig, and this wasn't relevant to the particular incident they were responding to, but they discovered that every single user in the org had Intune admin privileges, right? Via Entra. It's just insane. So I'm guessing, that's an obvious misconfiguration that you're going to find with all sorts of tools. But I'm guessing, the stuff that you're going to find with yours is, going to be much more subtle and not something that you can easily enumerate just with a basic config checker.
No, it's not like direct admin access. Like I can see that Bob owns this, or every user has that into an administrator role. It's more the subtle, I guess, roles that can use to be like reset the privileges of some other role that is running as like an application, and then it just traverses a longer path. I think that's why people use Bloodhound, is because we just go further in depth in terms of what can you grant yourself access to, not what you have access to now. Years ago, we used to talk about like assume breach mentality, and if you are operating under that assume breach, I think most people say like, okay, in the past we would detect where we would catch you, after that. That's great, but detections will fail. If you're going to operate under assume breach, you have to understand how the adversary views your environment and what paths they have available. Because like the assume breach was like, let's get beyond the perimeter defenses. Now let's talk about what the inside of your organization looks like and how we would take it over.
Now, it's not just connecting on-prem AD to Azure. You're doing a lot of work to extend the graph out into all sorts of places. I think you've been doing some work, and I don't know how much this is public, but you've been doing some work around GitHub Enterprise, right? That looks very interesting.
Yeah, so our research team is busy at work in multiple locations. So for those that have been following us for years, our first iteration into Azure was actually in 2018. But it took us until 2022 to add Azure. Now, we're not going to be that long. I'm just going to throw that out there. We were a much smaller organization back then. But we like to build up a corpus of research and make sure that we know what we're talking about before we extend the graph. Our team has been researching GitHub, certainly one. We did a post-breach analysis of the Snowflake incident recently. And we're also, we just released at Black Hat Project 8-Man, which is attack paths into AWS. So this kind of concept and the fundamental approach to managing attack paths internally is going to extend beyond Active Directory and Azure. That just happens to be the backbone of most folks' identities today.
It's interesting when you talk about extending the graph out to all of these different places and finding all of the different places where sort of privileges and identities and that whole mix and attack paths through them. You know, I think it's even, you know, it's just wild when you start thinking about the combinations, the permutations, and the paths that you get once you grow it to that level. And at that point, you know, I think one of the things people have been using you for traditionally in Active Directory is more they'll fire up Bloodhound every month or two, try to find if there's some sort of problem, and deal with it. But I'm guessing once you've expanded it out to all of that, it's going to be a much more sort of live view, I'm guessing, right? Like, do you foresee that once you've really started plugging all of this together, that it's going to be a lot more chatty? Bloodhound, like it's going to be Bloodhound Enterprise is going to be more something that is constantly giving you a updated view of what's going on, and like there's going to be also interesting ways for people to sort of use that for enrichment and, you know, plug it into operations. I'm guessing that that's kind of where you're going with this, right?
Yeah, like people already use Bloodhound Enterprise in a continuous fashion, and people are enriching their alerts to, like, you know, we have data across every object in their graph. So, you know, if you get an alert from a different system, we can tell you if that object is connected to something and like if it could reach tier 0 and kind of take over the environment. The interesting thing though is like
there's an identity alert over here and you should take it seriously because of this reason, I'm guessing is where that
you
goes.
You might not know, like Jane isn't a domain admin or a global administrator, but Jane connects to that, and that might not be obvious by just checking the directory listing, right? But we know that. Andy did some research a while back about how he took over an Azure tenant through a GitHub, through a GitHub action. So, I mean, that's going to be where the alert, like the continuous monitoring really kicks in, is like if a developer...
You can't just mention that and move on. Like, walk me through how that worked.
So, so the GitHub, there was a GitHub action that was feeding a service principal in Azure, and that Azure service principal eventually connected up to, like, through applications. I can't remember exactly the makeup of the attack path. It was a year and a half ago at Way West Hack and Fest, but that was pretty interesting. And that I think is what we get really nervous about. You know, if you think about the old days where you had to be an administrator to put a domain trust in, your developers can authorize or authenticate a GitHub action to run as a service principal in your tenant. So now you've just handed off the authentication to a different platform altogether. And you're basically just trusting that they're operating as who they say they are. And that just gets really...
I mean, this is the way the kids are going to roll, right? Like, I mean, the most fascinating thing that I think I've seen in the last, 5-10 years was just these scattered spider kids. And, before them, the Lapsus people. Like, I really appreciate... I know that sounds like a weird way to put it, but I really appreciate the way the kids are hacking these days because it's, it's very creative. It's not stuff from our era, right? Like this is new TTPs, and a lot of it involves, exploiting identities and identity sprawl and privilege sprawl and all of that, right? So I think it's interesting that you're building a technology that to a degree is going to deal with, the attacks of tomorrow, right?
Yeah. I mean, it'll give you a different example. The ESX vulnerability that just got disclosed, where you could just call yourself ESX admins group and you just operate as admins. Like that's that's very obvious. Another hybrid attack path where you're crossing an Active Directory into ESX land, and regardless of the permissions there, I mean, we can model that very easily. That was kind of bananas, but like that's an actual vulnerability. But I think whenever you're crossing platforms, like it can be non-obvious to the administrators or the security team that is charged with the security of that platform that there are things outside of their control or their view that is affecting the security of that platform. That's a really complicated way of saying this hybrid visibility is pretty critical.
Well, I should be clear too, when I say they're the attacks of tomorrow, don't get me wrong, they've already started. It's just that these are going to be the bulk of what we see. I think in the future, they're going to be like 90% of what you're going to see is going to involve people traversing through systems, crossing boundaries in unexpected ways because of weird privileges and the way various privileges interact across boundaries in unexpected ways, right? So, and that's the tooling you're building.
Yeah, we another example that we found after lighting up the hybrid attack path was an attack path started on Active Directory, went into an Azure tenant, and then crossed the tenant boundary into another tenant, which we had visibility into both, so we could see it. But that was pretty scary. That's kind of exactly what happened with the SVR, or the Russia breach into Microsoft earlier this year.
Yeah, I get my Microsoft breaches mixed up as well. But yeah, that was a fascinating attack, and clearly evidence that we need to be paying a little bit more attention to this stuff than we do. Like, I feel like for the first time, like we needed this sort of tooling like 10 years ago, right? And better late than never, I guess. Justin Kohler, thank you so much for joining me to talk about how you are now gluing Bloodhound on-prem with Bloodhound Azure and, expanding the graph out in all sorts of interesting directions. A real pleasure to chat to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That was Justin Kohler there from SpectreOps, this week's sponsor. And Bloodhound Enterprise, great product. You should definitely check it out. Bang for buck in terms of just making your environment that little bit more resilient. It's a very worthwhile exercise. That's it for this week's show. I do hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back tomorrow in our other podcast feed, talking to Tom Uren for the Seriously Risky Business podcast. And we'll be back with another weekly show next week. But until then, I've been Patrick Gray. Thanks for listening.